we go. Good evening, frogs and french fries and all my freaky friends. Good to see ya. I'm Tad. Still Tad. Still Tad. Every damn day I wake up and I'm still Tad. But that's my burden to bear, not yours. I hope your results are better, but whatever they may be, your mileage may vary. I am here for the next hour to, among other things, to read. As I mentioned last night, I'm still in the kind of working limbo of trying to do several different things all at the same time, including copy editing Navigator's Children, which I'm now getting down to the last 100 and something pages of, should have done in the next day or two. Was technically supposed to have it done by tomorrow, but I'm begging for the mercy of the literary gods that they will grant me a couple of extra days because things have been complicated. Things are always complicated. That's just the way life is. Anyway, so what else is there to tell you, my friends? Not a huge amount. I'm working on Navigator's Children. Going to get back to work on Ordinary Farm No.339, which is obviously the third, el tercero, as we say in Spanish. And then I'm going to go back to The Splintered Sun, which I haven't actually started on yet in terms of putting words on paper, but I have started in the sense of working it in my head, thinking it through, doing a lot of the work that I would normally be doing bit by bit as I went along. But because I've had this long enforced downtime with these two other projects, I am forced to do a lot of my work in my poor, tiny, undersized brain. I know, don't let it fool you. This large, bald expanse looks rather largish, but the brain inside just rattles around like a chickpea in a bucket. Anyway, so what else is there? Just taking care of dogs, taking care of cats, taking care of house and life, hanging out with wife and children, and occasionally with other friends when possible. Mostly by phone at the moment or in emails because I'm not getting out of the house a lot. That's not a complaint. I'm one of those people who's actually happy when I've got work to do that I can just stay home and do it. So as I said, no big deal. But that's what I'm doing. Anything else? Not really that springs to mind. Let me check in and see if anybody is dropping any information. Claudia is here, I see. Alexandra is here. Isaac, hello, Isaac. Matthew, my agent, hello, Matthew. Good to see you, buddy. Isaac, hello. Good to see you, as always. That's the Matthew Bialer there is my agent and a very, very fine human being. Matthew is, as well as being a very fine agent. Isaac, I said hello to. Andre, good to see you. Tash, hello. Ron, good to see you, buddy. Kelly, Kenrick, good to see you. And Becca has popped into. Medardo, un placer, señor. Angie and Emily and Barb Ann and Ray Weatherford. I think I've pronounced it correctly this time. James, hello James, that's James Werfs. Christy and Alexandra, who I already said hello to. Carl Dersham and Susan Shamblin. So a pleasure. Christy asked, and Jeremy. Hi, I hadn't seen you, Jeremy. Lovely to see you. Tash, I would love to come back to Australia. We'll see. That the problem is all throughout the industry these days, they're spending much less money on putting authors out on tour. In fact, in general, as with so many other businesses, I would even say they're pushing a great deal of the publicity budget back on, or the publicity responsibilities back onto the writers. This is not just my publishers. This is everybody's publishers. More and more, it's like what I was complaining about the other night with phone trees and all that. More and more businesses are trying to get other people, namely customers, or in my case, the authors, to do the work. So I am going over to Germany in late May. I don't have any current things on the, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't owe... Sorry, I read Tash's message and it confused me for a moment. I don't have any immediate plans to go to Australia or New Zealand, but I would love to, having been to both places a few times and always enjoying myself. So Anyway, so who else is? Somebody just had a comment, and I just lost track of it. It was Christy, I think, was asking something. So Christy, it's your comment has now rolled down behind beyond my ability. You've heard me complain. Oh, I see there in the background. Okay, what you what you are asking about is that. Oops, I always forget which side I'm on. This cat here and what this cat's name is. The black cat is TJ, and the orange cat is PJ, which they're both confusing as hell. So at this point, I'm calling the orange cat Peach Pit James, PJ, and Peach or Peach Pit for short to make it easier to remember. And I'm calling the black cat, whoops, up here, TJ, or Tyrannosaurus Jerome for short. If you may notice also, depending on if the cat which direction the cat walks past the camera at some point, TJ, the black cat, currently looks like he's wearing a pair of assless chaps from the Folsom Street Fair. That's because he had the whole back of his butt and undercarriage shaved for an operation just a couple weeks ago. So his fur is slowly growing back, but he does look pretty funny. But don't tell him, please. He's already very self-conscious. Do not tell him. Anyway, okay, so did I say hello to everybody? Yes, yes, yes. Okay. So, all right. And Matt, my agent, points out that I went to Australia and New Zealand with Greg Bear, and I certainly did. We had a lovely, lovely trip there, Greg and I, and in fact kind of developed a bit of a vaudeville act where he would be the serious-minded hard science fiction writer, and I would be the dippy-loopy fantasy writer. At least that's kind of how we played it. It did, however, I'll tell this story briefly before I start reading. I had never met Greg before. I had read his work. If you haven't, you should. Greg is a very, very, very fine writer. Was a very, very fine writer. Lovely guy, too. Really nice person. And Greg, I had read many of Greg's books because, among other things, Deborah had been his British publisher, just as she was my British publisher. And that's how we met. But anyway, so at the time, it was Deborah's publishing company that set up the tour for Greg and I in Australia and New Zealand. And I had never met Greg in person before, only, as I said, read his books. But at the time, this is before I started taking what's essentially Paxil, an SSRI for anxiety. I was a very bad flyer. I could do it. I could fly on planes, but it was a really miserable experience. Any of you who are phobic will know what I'm talking about. It was like for weeks ahead of time before I had to fly, I had this feeling of impending doom, and the flight itself, I felt like I was a cow being loaded onto a cattle car on its way to the slaughterhouse. And it's not an intellectual thing. It doesn't do you any good to know that that's what's going on, because a phobia is deep, deep, deep in your system, and it reacts, like you would if a lion was chasing you, or a bunch of people were going to string you up and lynch you or something. I mean, it's it's below the conscious level of intellectual response. It doesn't matter what anybody says or what happens. But anyway. So I was meeting Greg's plane, the same plane that we were both going to take, in Los Angeles, because Greg had flown down from the Pacific Northwest. So when I got onto the plane in Los Angeles and got to my seat, there was Greg, who, although I'd never met him before, I knew him from his photos on his book jackets and stuff like that. So, I mean, it was no big surprise. And I very quickly said hello to him and, said, look, I just want to tell you one thing before we take off. I'm a really bad flyer. I have a phobia about it. I'll manage. I'll be okay. But in case I get suddenly silent or white-knuckled or won't talk to you or whatever it might be, do not take it personally. It's just me. I hate airplanes. And so Greg, being the hardcore science engineering kind of guy that he is, went, "Oh, you don't have any need to be worried about these planes. These planes today are so, they've got so many safety features and all that." And I'm kind of going, "Don't tell me about it, Greg. I don't want to hear." I mean, I didn't literally say it, but I was hoping he could pick up my vibes. So I'm going like, mm-hmm. And we're getting ready to take off. He's going, "Yeah, no, I mean, I just read a story the other day where one of these things just like lost power and fell 30,000 feet in, I don't remember how long, a couple of minutes or less, 30,000 feet in uncontrolled free fall. But they were able to pull it out at 800 feet, even despite this huge plane, they were able to get the engines back on and pull it out at 800 feet and everybody was fine." And I was just looking at him like, "I can't believe you just said that." I'm going, "They were not fine, Greg. They were not fine. Those people's quality of life was ruined forever. What are you talking about?" And he was just looking at me like he just couldn't understand what I was complaining about. It's like, "But they were okay." I'm going, after falling for 8 minutes or whatever it was, after tumbling 30,000 feet through the air, you're telling me they were okay? They may have survived. That is not the same as being okay. Anyway, I was very worked up about this, but we went on to become very good friends, I think. I certainly enjoyed my time with Greg. I had great fun with him, and, we were friends ever after that. We miss him very much, and his wife Astrid, who is still with us, but, who we haven't had much chance to see lately. We miss her too, but we miss Greg because he's gone. He's another one of the people that we've lost and that we mourn. So anyway, but just such a perfect case of two people just completely on a different wavelength. Anyway, so that said, are there any other questions or anything that I needed to answer if they haven't dissolved by their... Angie has phobias. No one was fine. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Tash. And Angie understands. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the many reasons that I have never, ever, ever, when anybody that I know tells me like, "Oh, I can't do that," or "I hate that," or "I'm sorry, that makes me really nervous," or whatever. I mean, I have been granted and graced, I guess, with the knowledge of what that feels like. What it feels like to be absolutely petrified by something that nobody else thinks is scary or should be scary. And having all kinds of well-meaning people try to say, "Well, why don't you just do this? Why don't you just do that?" In fact, back in the early days of my my writing career, when I realized that if I was going to have a writing career, I was probably going to have to fly fairly often, because in those days we were doing book tours and stuff. And in fact have, because of my writing career, have flown hundreds of times. Like I said, I discovered drugs that would help. But I remember the revelation or the realization hit me so strongly that I wrote a story called Non-Stop, which you can probably still find in the Best of Tad Williams or one of those. I think it's in the book called Write, the collection of various shorter pieces called Write, R-I-T-E. And maybe some other places as well. But anyway, it's called Non-Stop. Thank you. It took me a moment there. It's a story called Non-Stop, and it's about somebody with a paralyzing fear of flying. And it was me working through it, I guess, in a sense. But the funny thing is that somebody asked me, like, a couple of months after it was published, or a couple of years after it was published, they said, "Well, did that story help you work through your fear of flying?" And I said, not only did it not help me one whit, but several people have written me to tell me that they didn't have a fear of flying until they read that story, and now they hate going on planes. So I had just managed to spread the infection, I guess. Anyway, all right, so we will go back to the reading of the Witchwood Crown. And that is what I'm going to continue with tonight. And the last section we read, we saw Jeza, who is a young woman from the Ran, from the swamps east of Naban, who had been picked up in her childhood as a helpmeet and companion for Duchess Canthia of Naban, and has stayed with her and is now acting as a sort of nurse to Duchess Canthia's two young children. on their way down from the family's ducal house, because Canthia is the wife of Duke Saluceris, who is the sort of the who not who is sort of who is the ruler essentially of Naban under Simon and Miriamel, who are the overarching monarchs. But Duke Saluceris, his wife Canthia, and Jaza, and the youngest baby, Saracena, had just come down from the hills into Naban, into the city. And on the way there was a riot that broke out, and a very scary, very freaky guy saying really weird things, and smiling the whole time, tried to crawl in through the window of their carriage, but was killed before he could get his hands on them. And they were saved by a guy named Viscount Matreu, a Southern Islander and also dark-skinned like Jaza, and brought back safely to the ducal residence and or the palace. So that is where we are now, and we're starting a new section right after that. It is an outrage, said Duke Saluceris. God preserve us! They tried to murder my wife and child. I will have my brother's head for this, and Dallo the Ingadarenes as well. We should move on Dallo now, before he can leave the city. This was Edexes Claves speaking, Lord Chancellor and one of the Duke's closest allies. But what of your brother? Demanded Rillian Albius, the Solicitor General. Like the other nobles crowded into the parlor, the leader of the Albion House was armed for war. We cannot take up Dallo and leave Drusus loose. The Stormbirds all but count your brother as their leader already. They know who holds the power. The Duchess, who had been stroking Saracena's face as she fell asleep in her basket, now stood. Stay with her, she told Jaza, before going to join the men. Canthia left the door open, doubtless to listen in case little Saracena should cry, but it allowed Jaza to hear and see what was going on. She was still fascinated by the Viscount. Since she had come to Naban, she had seen almost no one who looked like herself, who was not a servant or something lower. Gentlemen, the Duchess said, I am as disturbed by this as any of you. Let me start that one again. Gentlemen, the Duchess said, I am as disturbed by this as any of you, but we cannot allow ourselves to be driven to illegal action. I beg your pardon, your grace, Idexes said, but legalities will do us no good when our enemies murder us in our beds. His tone was respectful, but his thin face looked as though he had bitten a lemon by accident. I doubt my husband feels the same. Do you, Saluceris? Jaza winced and was glad no one could see her in the darkened room where the baby was sleeping. The Duchess was generally sweet-tempered, but Canthia did not like Idexes at all. If the Duke did not take her side, there would be trouble later. It is more complicated than that, my dear wife, said Saluceris. Jaza could almost feel the look she felt sure the Duchess must be giving him. Of course it is, my dear husband. That is the point I am making. Do you think that if you round up the leaders of the mob, they will admit that Drusus and the Ingadarenes urged them to riot? They will tell the truth under torture, insisted Rillian Albius. They will say anything their torturers suggest, said the Duchess, and their families will hate us forever, and other houses will take their sides who are now neutral. And Lector Vidian himself will denounce us. Do not forget that he became lector, largely because of Dallo Ingadaris's father. And I have not even pointed out that the High Queen in Erkinland, Miriamel, is Ingadarene by blood. How much sympathy will we have from the high throne if we execute the Queen's cousin on the evidence of a few tortured peasants? Jaza could hear Idexes struggling to remain courteous. And what does her grace suggest? That we allow this attack to go unpunished? That we pretend it never happened? Do you know they burned 3 of my warehouses? 900 gold imperators worth of goods lost. For all your talk of murder, the Duchess said, your concern seems to be more with your money? That is unfair. Your grace, must I have my motives impugned? Idexes was clearly talking to the Duke now. Jesus saw him clink past the opening of the door, his armor jingling. "We are your staunchest allies, Duke Saluceris. Must we suffer for it?" "Enough, enough." Saluceris sounded tired and frustrated, his anger now turned on something more inward. "Yes, Idexes, you are my ally. I do not forget that. And I'm sure the Duchess does not forget it either. Do you, my lady?" "Of course not, my lord." But Canthia did not sound very contrite. "May I say something, your grace?" Jesus straightened a little, recognizing the voice of Viscount Matrio, her rescuer. "Why is this man here?" Brilliant Albius asked suddenly. "Those of us gathered here have been with you all along, your grace. Who is this man, and how does he gain a place among us?" "You know me perfectly well, Count Rilian," said Matreo. "This man saved my life and the life of the Duke's child," said the Duchess. "Have you something to say against him? Because I will be interested to hear what that might be. That would keep the one man who actually did something useful out of this discussion." "Please, my dear, Rilian did not know all that happened, as he has just arrived." But the Duke's voice was indeed a little sharper as he addressed the Count of Albius. "Matreo has done a heroic thing, for which you should all thank him 1,000 times. Of course he may speak." "Thank you, your grace. I only wish to point out that the riot did not begin this evening. It began last night, when 3 men wearing the Engadarene albatross were found dead on the steps of the Sacred Redeemer's Church in Tellus Narasi. The rumor is that it was another brawl between kingfishers and stormbirds, as they more and more call themselves. But this one went further than most and ended in murder. To put things plainly, it was not difficult for your enemies to find angry folk in that neighborhood this morning. If my counsel means anything, I suggest that an even-handed approach might be more useful. Find all who engaged in the brawl, no matter which side they were on, and punish the survivors." "Are you mad?" said Idexes. "Punish our own men for defending themselves. Your grace, the Engadarenes swagger all over the north side of the city, as though one of their own sits here in the Sancellin Mahistrevis. They pick fights with our armed soldiers when they can find them, and when they cannot, they find innocents who happen to be wearing some token of support for your throne, and then beat them half to death. Apparently a few of these villains ran into someone who fought back against their mischief. You cannot make an example of your own supporters." "I disagree," said Matreo. "That is exactly what you must do if you wish to keep the peace, Duke Saluceris. Punish all who engage in illegal brawling, regardless of what badge they wear or to what house they bear allegiance. Only that way will you convince the rest of Naban that you want peace and justice." "Peace and justice," snorted Rilian. "It sounds to me as though you wish to take the sword from the Duke's hand and replace it with a justice's staff. Do you confront your own enemies with a book of laws?" "Sometimes it is not so easy to know who your enemies are, Count Rilian, and sometimes those who act with foolish swiftness make more enemies than they dispatch." Jaza had to restrain the urge to cry out in pleasure at this sally, as if she were watching a game of feather float between her brothers back home in Red Pig Lagoon. She knew that if she made a noise, she would certainly be sent away, so she moved a little farther back into the shadows and sat with her hand over her mouth. Still, she was delighted to know that someone who looked so much like herself could stand and trade words with some of the mightiest men in Naban. "Your Grace," said a new voice with the gravelly scrape of age, "I think we waste our time in argument between ourselves that makes more smoke than heat. This is your decision and yours alone." "That I know, uncle," the Duke said, And as always, I value your calm words, but I would still know your mind." Now Jason knew it was old Envales who had spoken, the brother of Duke Saluceras's late brother. Jason had not heard him come in, but it made sense he would be present, since he was one of the Duke's chief counselors. She liked Envales, who was one of the few members of the household beside the Duchess herself who ever spoke to Jason. Sometimes he even brought her apples from his estate outside the city. "As it happens, Your Grace, I agree with Count Idexes and Count Rillian that this assault on your wife and child cannot be ignored. But I also think there is merit in what Viscount Matreu says. Surely the people of Naban will be as angered at this dreadful affront as we all are. Never forget, the real danger here is your brother. Without Drusus, Dallo in Gadarus is only a fat nobleman with money." "A fat nobleman with more money than God himself, and 500 armed men inside the city walls," protested Idexes. "Nevertheless, it is not solely in Gadarene gold that creates this rebellion," Envales said. "Some of the concerns they speak for are genuine, even if their motives are not." "Such as?" asked Saluceras. "We have talked of it several times in the past sennight already," said his uncle. "The Thrithings folk continue to raid the easternmost counties, burning settlements, stealing cattle and sheep, killing those who oppose them. Much of Count Dallo's influence comes from the border nobles. They are frightened, and they are right to be so. The men of the grasslands are numerous. If they ever cease fighting among themselves, if anyone ever unites them, Naban itself will be in danger. All the civilized lands will be." "I respect your uncle's wisdom," said Reales in a way that made it sound to Jeza as if he spoke through clenched teeth. "But I think in this case he is being foolish." Sorry, that should be Rillian. That's a misprint. "I respect your uncle's wisdom," said Rillian in a way that made it sound to Jeza as if he spoke through clenched teeth. "But I think in this case he is being foolish." "Dangerous words," said the Duchess, but she was not as loud as she could have been. "Why foolish?" asked Saluceras. "Because any movement against the Grasslanders will rebound against us," Rillian said. "Shall we send Drusus to fight them? Or Dallo, or Tyanus Sulis? Because the Sulian lands are threatened as well. Should one of them defeat the Grassmen, but die in battle, yes, then all would be well. But if he pacifies the Thrithings and brings prisoners and booty back to Naban like one of the old imperators, what then? And if that victorious general is your brother Drusus, the very people who support you most would step aside to let him be put on the ducal throne." "What you say makes sense, but does that mean we cannot strike the Grasslanders at all?" demanded the Duke. "I have no heir to send. My son Blazes is scarcely 3 years old, a bit too young to carry my standard into battle." "Do not jest, husband, please." Canthia sounded genuinely pained at the thought. "Send me, Your Grace," said Idexes suddenly. "Let me lead a force against the Thrithings men. I will make those mudmen fear the Kingfisher again." "But it must not be only your allies who do this," said old Envales. "Nobles of the houses whose lands have been raided must also be allowed to satisfy their honor and their greed for glory and plunder." "What plunder could the Grasslanders have?" Rillian snorted. "Wagons? Sheep?" "Horses," came Matreu's prompt reply. "The finest horses in all the world. Several thousand thriving steeds would be prize enough for any campaign. and their bloodlines would enrich our stables for centuries. More importantly, though, it would draw the attention of the common folk, who already talk about the grassmen as though they were unstoppable demons. But do not forget justice for this riot, too, Your Grace. An even-handed punishment, not unduly severe except for those who actually incited or committed murder, will also help to pour water on Dallo and Gadarene and your brother, where they would rather set a fire. Either the room fell silent then, or the voices of those discussing these... Start that one again. Either the room fell silent then, or the voices of those discussing these high, frightening matters fell too low for Jeza to hear. She did not know what to think, although she was prejudiced toward all Viscount Maitreyu had said. She wished she knew more about him, this unlikely man who had suddenly thrust his way into the very innermost circles of the Duke's household. She curled up beside Saracina's cradle, but still felt unsettled. Such terrible things. War, murder, torture, all discussed in a single room in a great stone house. How can men rule other men? She wondered. How do they know they are right and not wrong? How can you know enough to take someone's life? Is that the difference between the Drylander's god and he who always steps on sand? Did their god, the one they worshipped in their high stone churches, direct the hands of men so that no man was killed who did not deserve it? She wished she could believe that. After a while, she took little Saracina out of her cradle and hugged her to her breast for comfort. The baby wiggled a bit, gurgled, and then was silent. Together, she and Jeza fell asleep in the dark. Chapter 36. A Foolish Dream. After riding for several days and nights across the Osterdeer plain, across thawing mud, newborn streams, and swelling rivers that had been covered in ice only a short time ago, Mako's talons now crossed back into the lands the snow seldom left, league upon league of empty tundra. Nezeru had never seen such a desolate, empty place. But for a few marks of wagon or sledge preserved in frozen mud, or the occasional view of a distant village, never more than a few high-peaked roofs, chimneys leaking smoke into the cold gray air, this might have been some country that neither mortal nor immortal had ever discovered. But Osterdeer was not as empty as it appeared. "Someone or something is following us," Mako announced as they ate a sparse meal one morning. "When the wind is right, I can smell animal fat and animal skins and the stink of mortals." "No mortal would be fool enough to let us catch him," said Keme, then looked at Jarnolf with a grin that was nothing more than bared teeth. "Surely even the Hikedaya are not foolish enough to think themselves unkillable," Jarnolf said. "It might be a good idea to learn who is following us." "It is not one, it is many," said Gogamgar. As usual, the giant sat at a distance from the rest of them. Mako, as master of the yoke that kept the monster docile, was always careful to stay beyond the reach of those long arms. Gogamgar was eating the carcass of a frozen elk he'd found, tearing the icy mass into pieces and devouring it, bones and all, with, Nezeru thought, the righteous pleasure of a Hikedaya nobleman eating slices from a still wriggling Lake Rumia salmon. The giant largely foraged for himself, devouring huge quantities of berries and leafy plants when he couldn't get meat. But when he did have the chance to hunt, he nearly always succeeded. Nezeru had seen him snatch a live squirrel off a branch and throw it into his mouth with a single motion, then swallow it in one gulp like a fur-covered berry. "Many?" Nezeru asked. "Many what?" "Many mortals. They are too far away to count their numbers, but their stink has been with us for a while. Gogamgar let out a deep rumbling laugh. I doubt they are fewer than this company, however. What small party of mortals would follow the Hikedaya? But who could it be? Nezru asked. These lands are mostly empty of settlements, Jarnulf said, but there are bandits who prey on travelers and merchant convoys all the way down to the Urkenlandish border. They find these empty lands a convenient base. There is also the Skaliar. Nezru heard Skaliar. Nezru heard a word she did not know. Skaliar, and who or what is that? Bandits, but of a different sort. They came from the remnants of the Rimmersgarders who fought for you Hikedaya in the war, although they did not understand that was what they did. They were crushed by your Zedaya cousins in Hernastir, and their leader, a man named Skali, was killed. After that, many of the survivors turned back to their gods. After that, many of the survivors turned their backs on their own people and the newer Adenite faith, returning to the gods of their forefathers. But do not think them allies. They believe both the Hikedaya and the Zedaya to be demons and will kill them when they can. Mako was staring out at the northern horizon where the snows still covered the meadows and the distant hills. It is interesting that you chose to bring us this way, and now we are followed, mortal. It is also interesting you know so much about these outlaw Rimmersmen. I helped you escape from goblins, Hand Chieftain Mako, when otherwise you all would have died. I brought you safely through the spring marsh and found river fords for you. And also I led you through the edges of the Dimmerskog without harm, where there are creatures uglier and more unpleasant to meet than even our friend Gogamgar. Still, you treat me with distrust, though you have traveled twice as fast and twice as far as you would have without me. Yes, just as we traveled swiftly toward the mortal ruler and his mortal army not so long ago. Jarnulf's face remained cold, his eyes unblinking. That mistake was not mine, as you well know, Mako. I grow tired of hearing that foolish accusation. Now Sao Meiji, who had been looking east, contemplating the foothills of Urmsheim, said, It is still not clear to me why you do help us, mortal. You have had many opportunities to escape. Escape? Jarnulf laughed. Why should I escape? I am no Rimmersman, whatever I look like. I was raised among the Hikedaya. You made me what I am. If I am not one of the most important servants of the Mother of all, I am still one of her huntsmen. Why should I not do what I can to aid her talons? You make a fair point, said Sao Meiji, lacing his fingers together and performing a bow that even Jarnulf must have recognized as mocking. We, Hikedaya, are a suspicious race, of course, having so often found ourselves betrayed by mortals. Forgive me for questioning your motives, huntsman. For a moment, as he turned from the singer in disgust, Jarnulf's icy blue eyes met Nezru's. She had no idea what the mortal was thinking, and that by itself was intriguing. In her small experience of his race, they were guileless as cattle. She did not fully believe him about his motives, but for some reason she could not quite name, she also did not believe he meant to betray them. I have never met a creature I understood less, Nezru thought. Not even the giant. Within days they reached the foothills the Northmen called Urmsbacher, and began the slow ascent toward Urmsheim itself, which jutted like a wolf's fang above the smaller peaks on either side. Farther south the world enjoyed the full coming of spring. Nezru knew that despite the snow on the ground, The slaves and bound workers outside Nakiga would be crawling out of their hovels to spend as much time as they could in the sun. But here, at the northern edge of the world, it was still winter, as it almost always was. As the cold mists rose, the slopes became steeper. Climbing became steadily more difficult. The Hikedaya were more and more often forced to lead their horses. Sometimes the giant had to lift the terrified animals over an obstacle. Nezeru found it almost painful to watch the usually stolid Nakiga steeds eye-rolling panic at the monster's touch. Other tracks were too narrow for Gogam Gar himself, forcing him to find a different way up. Mako would always keep him in sight, the crystal goad clutched firmly in his hand until the giant had rejoined the procession. Unless he was giving orders, Mako hardly talked with any of the company, but except the singer Sao Meiji during these days, which made Nezeru uneasy. She did not understand exactly what had happened at Bitter Moon Castle, but it was clear Akinabe's intervention had changed things profoundly, and even Mako himself seemed uneasy with their new mission. They were near the base of Urmsheim itself, working their way up a difficult hill when the attack came. The slope was scree, spotted with drifts of snow, an accumulation of loose rock and boulders that the horses, if led, could just manage to climb. Because of the danger to whoever was below, they took the horses up one at a time. Keme had already reached the crest, and Sao Meiji had climbed it behind him. Nezeru watched from the bottom of the hill as Jarnolf led his own horse up over the loose rock. The mortal was almost as light and precise of foot as the Hikedaya, but that did not prevent both man and mount nearly tumbling when an errant hoof started a small avalanche beneath them. Nezeru moved quickly to the side to avoid stones as big as her head tumbling toward her. Jarnolf spread his arms for a moment before regaining his balance. He examined his horse, which had toppled onto its side, then urged the shaken beast onto its feet again and began to lead it up the last few steps to the crest. It had become clear earlier that the giant would not be able to make it up this loose slope without causing a much larger rockfall, so the great beast and Mako were taking a longer but less steep way, a gully strewn with boulders so large that the giant often had to put Mako's horse under his arm and carry it, like a Nakiga noblewoman with a pet lynx. The horse occasionally wriggled and kicked in fear at being held by the monster, but it had been raised in the stables deep beneath the mountain and stayed silent. As Nezeru stood, poised to begin her own climb as soon as Jarnolf was off the dangerous slope, she saw Mako turn abruptly as though someone had shouted to him. A moment later he staggered. Nezeru thought the usually sure-footed Mako had simply put a foot wrong until she saw the arrow quivering in his shoulder. Then the chieftain slipped from the tall rock and tumbled out of her sight. A moment later, loud, hoarse cries tore the air as a troop of bearded men came swarming across the hilltop towards Semek, Keme, and Sao Meiji from both sides, loosing arrows. The first flights missed, which gave the two Hikedaya a chance to find shelter behind an outcropping near the brow of the hill, but it was clear that in moments they would be surrounded and cut down. Nezeru counted something near 24 attackers, all mortal men in ragged clothing. Only a few had drawn their bows. The rest hurried forward with axes and swords raised. There was no time to force her horse to climb the slope. Nezeru scrambled upward as quickly as she could, using her hands almost as frequently as her feet. Arrows began to snap past her head. The enemies atop the hill had seen her. Trying to move swiftly over the loose stones was like a bad dream, but Nezeru knew she had no choice, since the slope offered nowhere to hide. An arrow ripped through her hood, where it lay against her back, but she kept scrambling upward on all fours. An instant later, just as she reached the top, another shaft broke against a stone, not an arm's length from her face. She threw herself down and lay with half her body still on the slope until she spotted her shaggy mortal attacker hurrying forward to finish her. Her bow was caught beneath her, so she pulled her knife and, after a split instant to locate the balance, threw it with as much strength as she could muster. The blade whirled end over end, and though she did not manage to lodge it in his throat, the pommel broke the man's nose, dropping him face first to the ground, with blood sheeting down his face. Safe for a moment, Nezuru turned to where Keme and Saumeji still huddled against the tall stone on the crest, even as a half-dozen or more of the bearded men drew closer with every heartbeat. The Northmen's excited shouts were as incomprehensible to her ears as the barking of hounds. She scrambled off the slope onto a snowy patch of dirty snow and dead grasses, then took her bow from her shoulder. Her first arrow missed, but her second took one of the attackers in the thigh. He stumbled and fell, then got to his feet to pluck the arrow from his leg. As he did, Nezuru knocked another arrow and sent it whistling through his chainmail and into his chest. The rest of the attackers were nearly on top of Saumeji and Keme, and some now split off from the main group to charge downhill towards Nezuru and Jarnulf, who stood only a little distance above her. She thought the mortals made an ugly collection, bearded men much bigger than herself, wearing ill-matched armor, slavering and howling like wild dogs. Jarnulf had thrown down his bow and pulled out his sword, and now he waded into the first pair to reach him. His blade so swift it seemed almost ghostly in the misty air. As Nezuru climbed back to her feet, she saw 3 more attackers sprinting toward her. She managed to knock one down with an arrow to the body, but couldn't tell whether the shot had been fatal. Then, as the other 2 rushed at her, one with sword drawn and the other swinging a heavy 2-handed axe, she threw herself forward, swinging her bow, and hit the axe-wielder in the face with it. He stumbled and fell to his knees, bleeding from the nose and eyes, but she had won only a momentary respite because his companion was still coming. Nezuru threw down the bow and drew her sword from its belt ring in time to guide the weight of the man's swinging blade to one side. But the bearded mortal was strong, and the point of his blade still hit her shoulder. Her Witchwood armor took most of the force, but her arm went numb, and for a moment she could only hold her sword with the other hand as her attacker turned, teeth bared and eyes wild, and rushed at her once more, blade swinging for her head. Behind him, the axe-wielding man whose nose she had broken was climbing to his feet. She had only moments before he came to help the swordsman. Rock, serpent, retreat, she told herself. Grass blade to take the force. A kick to keep him going. She parried. Her opponent stumbled past as she whirled away and then helped him along with her foot. But even as he staggered and lost his footing, stopping himself only by putting his sword hand and blade flat on the snowy ground, the axe-man was on her. His face streaming with blood, the whites of his eyes staring out of the scarlet smear as bright as candle flames. He had clearly decided that she was no easy victim, and began to move her backward with swift but skillful swings of his axe. She dared not try to take the blows on her sword. The blade might survive the clash, but her shoulder was still tingling from the swordsman's strike, and she was afraid she might lose all sense in it if it was hit hard again. But she could hear the man with the sword getting up behind her, his boots scuffling in loose stones. She located Jarnulf, barely visible in the mist and still occupied with his own attackers. She could not even guess what Keme and the singer were doing. The dance, she reminded herself. Think only of the dance of sacrifice. Nezuru had spent hour after hour in the blood yards, as her teachers sent armed men and women against her, some of them already trained sacrifices, but far more often criminals and slaves who had tried to escape and were now forced into the role of unwilling soldiers, with no hope of living out the day unless they killed her. In just one of the grueling sessions at the yard, she had fought from the 3rd hour of the clock until the 9th, facing 22 opponents in all. The last, as Nezuru was staggering with weariness, had been a trained killer named Summer Ice, one of the Order of Sacrifice's most deadly graduates, but under sentence of death for being found drunk on duty. I beat him, she reminded herself, though I was half dead when I fought him. I killed them all. That is why I am here. I stand for the Queen, she shouted. Her enemies could not understand her, of course, but the swordsman shouted something back and charged her. The first surprise of the attack over, she reminded herself what her sword mentors had taught her and began to take control, planning ahead as if she were playing Shent with her father. She angled herself so that she could retreat toward the spot where Jarnolf fought, then did her best to even the odds by not letting her opponents get onto either side of her. She was startled by a sudden, loud crack like thunder, then another. But although she could see flashes of light at the corner of her eye, she dared not look. The dance, she told herself, only the dance. But that did not mean she could not pretend to look. At the next loud thunder crack from nearby, she swiveled her eyes for an instant. The swordsman took the bait, swinging for her neck. She dropped to her knees and gutted him with a swift two-handed thrust of her own blade, then was back up again before her other foe could take advantage. Now she could hear the noises of sword on sword very close behind her. "Mortal, I am here," she called. "I can see you, Queen's woman," Jarnolf said. "Stay where you are. I have a little trick I've been saving." Her own moment came as he was speaking. Her opponent swung his heavy axe again, but though she had to move quickly to avoid it, she could see that he was tired and starting to slow. So as he pulled it back again, she leaped toward him and stabbed downward, shoving her light, narrow blade through his foot so that he shrieked and stumbled backward. She held onto her blade, widened her stance, bent and yanked hard. The man went over on his back in a puff of snow, losing his axe as he fell. She tried to free her sword to finish him, but the blade would not come completely loose from his boot, so she scooped up the man's own axe and crashed it through his forehead before he could do more than rise onto his elbows. He fell back, his already unlovely, broken-nosed face now a scarlet ruin. She turned in time to see the end of Jarnolf's trick. He was whirling his sword above his head with only one hand on the hilt. Nezuru could not tell whether it was to be attack or defense. The lone mortal man facing him could not understand it either, and with a shout of frustration threw himself forward just as Jarnolf let go of the sword, which flew well over the man's head and disappeared behind him. As the man gaped at this bizarre ploy, Jarnolf ducked under the man's swinging cut, then seemed to clutch at the bearded fighter's waist. A moment later, they both went down in a confusing roil of furs and limbs. Jarnolf was the one who stood up, however, his unusually long knife gripped in his hand. Not even Nezuru had seen him draw it, but it was bloodied almost to the guard. "You fight like a sacrifice," she said. "I told you the great Shokai himself taught me." The mist was streaming past them now, caught by a sudden wind from the heights. Nezuru found she could see across the hill crest, which was littered with the bodies of their enemies. Mako had been knocked to the ground by a huge man with an eye patch, who stood over the chieftain ready to finish him. She scrambled down the slope, but knew she would never reach them in time. The one-eyed man brought his sword up to stab Mako, but just before the killing blow fell, the mortal looked in Nezuru's direction, and his lone eye opened wide with surprise, as if she were a long-lost daughter, some child he had thought never to see again. "You?" was all he said. Then an arrow sprouted from his chest, shivering among his furs like the branch of a leafless tree. His mouth gaped in his thick, dark beard, and Nezuru saw blood run down his chest like a black river. Then another arrow took him in the forehead and threw him backward to the ground. Only then did Nezuru turn to see Jarnolf, who had scrambled back to his discarded bow. Only then did she realize that it must have been him, not her, who had so surprised the one-eyed man. Nezuru's legs were still moving, but now without purpose. She stumbled to a stop. Nothing else stirred except Jarnolf as he crunched across the snowy gravel toward her. "He was a big one," he said, but she thought she heard something beneath his words, something that gave the lie to his offhand tone. "But still I think Mako will not thank me." "The mortals seem to recognize you," Nezuru said, then immediately wished she hadn't spoken. "Never give what you know away until it is useful to reveal it." That was what her father had taught her, and her mother too, both in their own ways, and it had been the root of many of her teacher's lessons in the order of sacrifice. Jarnolf gave her a look. "Recognize me? Not likely," he said, but again she thought she detected something more beneath the words. "I've never seen the ugly bastard before." He looked around. "I don't see anyone else coming. I think that was all of them." She held her tongue as they reached Mako, who lay on his stomach, struggling to rise. The arrow that had struck him earlier was gone, although the wound was obvious and bloody. Nezuru had no doubt the chieftain had pulled it out with his own hands, eager to join the fighting. A short distance away, beside the big stone, they found Keme and Sao Meiji in the middle of a circle of bearded corpses. Keme was wounded in a dozen places, but was already sitting up, tightening his belt around his arm to staunch the blood from the worst of his wounds. The singer lay motionless a short distance away. He seemed unharmed as far as Nezuru could see, and even when she turned him over, she could find no blood, but he was utterly insensible and limp as a rag, as though he had fallen asleep in the middle of the life and death struggle. What happened here? She wondered aloud. What did these mortals want? Jarnolf bent over one of the corpses and cut something free, then held it up, a wedge-shaped piece of iron dangling on a leather cord. "Do you see this?" He shook the heavy medallion. "Hovnir, the axe of Udin Rimmer, the old god of my people. These are Skaliar, as I guessed. But why should they hunt us?" Jarnolf shrugged. "We are bound for Ermsheim. There is a place there called the Udin Tree, sacred to the old gods of the Rimmer's folk. I told you they think your people demons. They wanted to keep us off their sacred ground. A foolish reason to die." She turned back to examining Sao Meiji. "Do you know any better ones?" Jarnolf asked, but before she could even wonder what such a strange thing meant, he let out a low whistle of surprise. When she turned to see what had startled him, she saw he had lifted up another corpse. It was really only half a corpse, though, since everything from the shoulders up was gone, leaving only a smoking tatter of burnt furs and blackened flesh, pierced by jagged bits of bone. "By God, what happened to this one?" Jarnolf said, his eyes wide. For the first time since the fighting had begun, she saw real fear on his face. "The singer did that," said Keme, getting unevenly to his feet. "A pretty trick of his I did not have much chance to watch. Something to do with stones. He killed several that way before he fell down like that. We must get him and Mako to shelter." Keme stared at her, blood smeared across his hawk-like face. "Until Mako can speak for himself, only I give orders. Half-blood." He pointed at Sao Meiji. "You two, take the singer. I will carry Mako." Jarnolf was looking around. "Where's the giant? I don't see him." Keme's mouth began to curl into a sneer until he grasped the meaning of what Jarnolf had said. Then, with a snarl of frustration, he fell to his knees and plucked at Mako's belt until he found the pouch that held the crystal rod. He stood up, holding it, and cupped one hand to his mouth. "Giant, where are you? Come to me now, or I will choke you and roast your heart. Do you feel your collar?" He held the rod near his lips, whispered something. Nezuru thought she heard a low murmur of song. An instant later, a terrible bellow of pain and fury rose from the slope below. "Curse you!" came Gogamgar's booming voice. I am trapped under stones down here. If you do that to me again, I will dig through the very mountain itself to rip your head off. Keme laughed harshly. He whispered to the rod again and was rewarded with another ground-shaking bellow from the giant. Well, I suppose we should dig him out, he said at last. Then he can carry the other two to shelter. And that's where we're going to stop. In part because it's time, in part because I just heard the barking dog announcing that pizza had arrived. Anyway, let me just mark this so I will know. Okay, good. So with that, I thank you, as I always do, for joining me. It's great fun to spend some time with you. I hope it was fun for you. And there is PJ over in the corner over there. Whoops, I always point the wrong way because this thing is flip-flopped. Anyway, so yes, so there is Peach Pit James, and I'm not sure where the Tyrannosaurus is gone. The assless chap's Tyrannosaur. But that is neither here nor there. What is here and there is that I will be back next weekend. See no reason why I won't be. So I hope you will come and join me then. Until then, please take good care of yourselves. Take good care of friends, loved ones, neighbors, all those kind of folk. Help out others. Pay it forward. And we will all muddle through this world together with the help of clean living and clean thoughts, or something like that. Anyway, thanks for joining me. See you soon. Peace and good night.